Are you confused by all these different shutter options in your X-H2S and potentially other Fujifilm cameras? Well, I was too, so I decided to buckle down and hit the books, and I want to share what I learned so you don't have to read through a dozen websites. You just have to listen to me for a few minutes. These shutter options exist on other Fujifilm cameras and really just about all mirrorless cameras in general, but I'm focusing on the X-H2S because its stacked sensor differentiates it from other cameras and enables the electronic shutter to be used to its advantage in ways that may not be the case for other cameras. And we'll get into the details in the video, but I just wanted to say that even if you're not using the X-H2S, you can still learn about the different shutter types and when and why to employ them in this video. If you're using one of the X100 cameras, those employ a leaf shutter, which doesn't have the same attributes of the typical curtain type shutters of most other cameras, so you're probably dismissed. And lastly, before we get started, I also want to say that I'm trying to keep this as layman's terms, Cliff's Notes level as possible, because Cliff Layman is my middle name. I want to start by going through the options, describe what they are, and talk about when and where you may want to use the different shutter types. The mechanical shutter is just what it sounds like. It is the traditional method of exposing a camera, whether film or digital, with two little curtains that open and close. Number two is the electronic shutter. So this is taking advantage of the computer age and ditching the mechanics of yesteryear, where there is no physical shutter that opens and closes. It's just the sensor itself turning on and turning off to expose for the picture. The next is the EF E-front curtain shutter. So this is one that's probably confusing to a lot of people, me included. And this is a combination of half electronic shutter and half mechanical shutter, equaling one awesome picture. We only really have three different types of shutter: mechanical, electronic, E-front curtain shutter. The last three options are just combinations of those three that are automated based on the parameters that it says in the camera. So we just want to talk about the differences between the three actual different types of shutter. Each of the three shutter types has strengths and weaknesses, and I like to break it down into three main considerations when you're trying to decide which one is going to be the right one. Number one is burst rate. How many photos in sequence do you want to be able to take? Number two is sharpness. What methods are you going to employ to ensure that you get sharp photos? And number three is overall image quality. Generally, the fastest burst rates are available in electronic shutter rather than mechanical, which makes sense because there's no mechanical parts required to move, just the sensor flashing on and off to expose the image. Another benefit of using electronic shutter is that you typically have faster potential shutter speeds. So in the mechanical shutter mode of the X-H2S, the fastest shutter speed available is 1/8,000th of a second versus 1/32,000th of a second in electronic shutter. And other cameras might even be able to go faster. The X-T5 and the X-H2, for instance, can go all the way to 1/180,000th of a second in electronic shutter mode, which is insane. Another potential benefit of electronic shutter is that there's no shutter sound. For scenarios where you don't want to be intrusive with your shutter clacking away, your camera can be completely silent. Of course, there are options to turn on simulated shutter sounds in the menu if you really need that auditory feedback. All of that sounds really good, so what about the cons of using electronic shutter? So the first is the image is subject to the readout speed of the sensor. And Fujifilm cameras, like most others, employ a rolling shutter CMOS sensor, which means that the image is read from top to bottom rather than getting recorded all at once. So if you're panning the camera fast or something is moving quickly in your shot, there is a potential of having what's called rolling shutter artifacts, where basically things that are supposed to be straight become bent. Another potential problem area is LED lights, which emit light in an on-off pulse that's invisible to the naked eye, but can be captured by your camera, resulting in a banding effect. These artifacts are usually eliminated or all but eliminated by using a mechanical shutter. However, and the reason I'm focusing on the X-H2S in this video is it has a stacked sensor, and the purpose of stacked sensors in cameras like this is to solve the problems of rolling shutter by having a sensor that's fast enough to read from top to bottom to negate the issue as much as possible. And there is another potential hidden downside of electronic shutter that Fujifilm and most other camera manufacturers don't want you talking about, and that is potentially worse image quality. And I couldn't really find anything other than rumors and speculation about whether the dynamic range in electronic shutter mode takes a hit on the X-H2S. This is something that typically happens because in order to read out the sensor that fast and to process all that data, something has to give because the processing just isn't fast enough. So typically what happens is the raw pictures go from 14-bit to 12-bit or 12-bit to 10-bit, depending on the capabilities of the camera. And I can't find anything in the manual and the specifications of this camera. Fujifilm only lists 14-bit RAWs as an option with this camera, whether that's uncompressed or compressed. However, I did some unscientific tests, which you can see here, and to me it does look like there is a hit to dynamic range and overall image quality. So take that for what it's worth. But in real world scenarios, if you don't intend to completely max out the shadow recovery slider like I did in these images, it's really not that big of an issue. And I think the advantages of shooting an electronic shutter with high burst rates, silence, etc. are worth the trade-offs if you need to take advantage of it. So I wouldn't worry too much about the image quality. Mechanical shutters can induce what's called shutter shock, where the opening of the front shutter can result in movement of the camera during the exposure, which causes motion blur in the image. To get around this with mechanical shutter, photographers typically use the reciprocal rule, which just means that you use a minimum shutter speed that is equal to the focal length of the lens. So, for instance, if you are using a 50mm lens, the slowest shutter speed that you would want to employ is 1/50th of a second. If you're using a 600mm lens, the slowest shutter speed you would want to employ is 1/600. This is just advice. It's not like a hard and fast scientific rule, and it mostly applies to shooting handheld. If you can shoot on a tripod or maybe brace the camera on something, then you can probably get away with slower shutters. But again, this is just sort of a rule of thumb. So the electronic shutter obviously eliminates shutter shock because there's no shutter movement, while mechanical shutter causes shutter shock, but reduces rolling shutter artifacts, and also potentially has higher image quality. But this is where the more obscure shutter option comes into play, which is electronic front curtain. So what the heck is this? So mechanical shutter is actually two curtains. The front curtain opens up to expose the sensor or film to light, and the rear curtain closes to stop the light from hitting the sensor to end the exposure. In E-front curtain, the front curtain is no longer employed. So in order to start the exposure, the sensor just turns on and becomes sensitive to light, and then the rear curtain does close to stop the exposure. So you've basically eliminated the front curtain from the equation. The front curtain is the culprit in shutter shock. So it's actually the opening of that causes the vibration of the camera and not the rear curtain closing, because at that point, the photo has essentially been taken. E-front curtain does make mechanical noise because the rear curtain does close, but it doesn't make as much noise as full-on mechanical shutter. So now that we hopefully understand the three types, when do you employ each? I think we've already answered this for electronic shutter, when you want the fastest bursts and or you want to be silent, and also when you want the fastest shutter speeds. What about mechanical? When you can ensure fast enough shutter speed, shutter shock won't be an issue. When you want to ensure the highest image quality possible, also use mechanical shutter when you want to ensure that there's no weird artifacts or you minimize weird artifacts. So that means the rolling shutter artifacts that could be a problem with electronic shutter. And to be fair, mechanical shutter doesn't eliminate those, but the shutter typically opens and closes fast enough that it minimizes or completely eliminates rolling shutter artifacts. And as you can see in this video, there are some lights that still will cause banding issues even in mechanical shutter. So what about the E-front curtain? So like I mentioned, this is the best of both worlds. You've got less mechanical noise, but still some mechanical noise. You still have the potential banding in certain scenarios, but it's also reduced. And I've also heard reports of weird bokeh shapes if the shutter is too fast, but I think Fujifilm limits this by making sure that the maximum shutter speed is only 1/8000th. And I tried some test shots and didn't really notice any difference in out of focus areas when I used 1/8000th in EF mode. The EF mode is perfect for shooting handheld, especially on longer lenses. It allows you to employ slower shutter speeds without inducing shutter shock. For me with the X-H2S, I typically stick with electronic shutter because I want to have the fastest possible burst rates. Even if it's not 40 frames per second, it's typically 15 to 20 frames per second. It really just depends on what kind of bird I'm photographing. Smaller birds are moving all over the place really quickly, and if you want to ensure or maximize your chances of getting a shot and getting shots in focus, having a really fast burst rate is handy. On top of that, I'm shooting handheld with a really long lens, the 150 to 600, so having the electronic shutter gets rid of the shutter shock factor. In more casual photographic settings, or basically where I don't need like insanely fast burst rates, then I typically will shoot in the electronic front curtain plus mechanical combo. So that would be EF plus M or E front plus mechanical. That means that the E front curtain works until 1/2000th of a second, and then the mechanical shutter takes over after 1/2000th. I hope all that made sense, but if it didn't and you're still confused, please let me know in the comments if there's any way I can clarify. And if you have some different advice, I would love to hear it. And yeah, really appreciate you watching, and maybe I'll see you in another video.